The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Ethan Mitchell's weathered face as he guided his horse along the rugged terrain north of Prescott. The year was 1876, and the borderlands between territorial claims remained as wild and untamed as when he'd first arrived 5 years ago. At 26, Ethan had already seen enough bloodshed and broken promises to last several lifetimes, yet something about this harsh country kept calling him back. Dense clouds of dust kicked up behind his stallion's hooves as he followed the winding trail toward the scattered homesteads that dotted these disputed lands. The afternoon heat shimmered off distant rock formations, creating wavering mirages that danced on the horizon. As a scout and occasional guide for settlers, Ethan had developed an intimate knowledge of this unforgiving landscape. Word had reached Prescott of increasing tensions between homesteaders and the remaining Cheyenne bands, who still claimed ancestral rights to these hunting grounds. Alexander Turner, a prominent rancher who'd built his spread along the territorial border, had been stirring up trouble with inflammatory speeches about clearing the savages out once and for all. The thought made Ethan's jaw clench with barely contained anger. Unlike many frontier settlers, Ethan had spent considerable time among the Cheyenne people during his younger years. His father, a missionary who'd worked on reservations back east, had taught him their language and customs. Though his father was long dead, those early lessons in understanding and respect had left an indelible mark on Ethan's character and worldview. The sound of gunfire suddenly crackled through the still afternoon air, echoing off the canyon walls to Ethan's right. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse toward the commotion, keeping to the cover of the rocky outcroppings. As he drew closer, he could make out shouts and the thunder of multiple horses at full gallop. Something was very wrong. Cresting a small rise, Ethan came upon a scene of chaos. 3 riders were pursuing a lone figure on horseback, taking occasional shots that kicked up dust around their quarry. Even from this distance, Ethan could see that the pursued rider was Cheyenne, and young, probably no more than 16 or 17 years old. The pursuers wore the distinctive yellow armbands of Turner's ranch hands. Moving swiftly but cautiously, Ethan guided his mount down a parallel ravine that would intersect the chase. He recognized Jacob Phillips among the pursuers, a mean-spirited man with a reputation for violence against Indians. The young Cheyenne rider was skilled, but his horse was tiring, and the pursuit was driving them toward a box canyon with no escape. Drawing his Winchester from its scabbard, Ethan positioned himself behind a cluster of massive boulders near where the ravines converged. The timing would have to be perfect. He had no illusions about the consequences of interfering with Turner's men, but he couldn't stand by and watch them murder a young man in cold blood. The pursuers' shouts grew louder as they approached his position. As the Cheyenne rider flashed past his hiding spot, Ethan took careful aim and squeezed off 2 rapid shots. The first struck the ground directly in front of Philip's horse, causing it to rear in panic and throw its rider. The second bullet shattered a canteen carried by one of the other men, spraying water across his saddle. In the ensuing confusion, both remaining riders pulled up short, their quarry temporarily forgotten. "The next shots won't miss," Ethan called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent landscape. "Turn back now, and we can all pretend this never happened." He kept his rifle trained on the men, knowing Phillips would be scrambling to remount. The 2 riders who were still ahorse exchanged uncertain glances, clearly weighing their options. Phillips's voice rang out from behind his spooked mount. "Mitchell, you're making a big mistake interfering with Mr. Turner's business. That Indian boy stole from the ranch. We're just bringing him to justice." The words dripped with false righteousness, but Ethan knew better. Turner's definition of justice rarely aligned with actual law or morality. 3 armed men chasing down one boy doesn't look much like justice to me, Phillips, Ethan replied steadily. Especially not when that boy happens to be Running Cloud's grandson. Does Turner know you're trying to start a war with the last peaceful Cheyenne band in the territory? This information caused visible unease among Phillips' companions, who clearly hadn't known the young rider's identity. The standoff stretched for several long moments before one of the other men, Benjamin Roberts, Ethan now recognized, spoke up. "Come on, Jake. It ain't worth dying over. Turner can sort this out proper-like with the Indian agent." Phillips cursed viciously, but finally nodded his agreement. The 3 men slowly backed their horses away before turning and galloping back toward Turner's ranch. Once they were gone, Ethan quickly rode in the direction the young Cheyenne had fled. He found him waiting just around a bend in the canyon, still mounted but watching warily. Ethan raised his empty hands and spoke in the boy's language, identifying himself as a friend who had known his grandfather. The tension in the young man's shoulders eased slightly, but his eyes remained cautious. The young Cheyenne warrior finally spoke, his voice carrying both pride and weariness. "I am Noah, grandson of White Eagle. My grandfather told me of you, Ethan, before he passed to the spirit world last winter." The revelation of White Eagle's death hit Ethan hard. The old chief had been a voice of reason during the troubled times, keeping peace when others called for war. Now his grandson carried that heavy legacy. Ethan studied Noah's face, seeing the familiar strong features that marked his lineage. "Your grandfather was a wise man. He taught me much about your people's ways when I first came to these lands." The canyon walls towered above them, painted in deep oranges and reds by the late afternoon sun. A cool breeze carried the scent of sage and dust. But this territory has changed. Turner and his kind won't stop until they have every acre. Noah's expression hardened at the mention of Turner. "The man claims our ancestral grazing lands belong to him now. He shows papers from Globe, but these lands were promised to us by treaty." He gestured to the surrounding canyon. "Our horses have run free here since before my great-great-grandfather was born. Now Turner's men shoot them, claiming they compete with his cattle." The situation was worse than Ethan had feared. Turner was notorious for using any means, legal or otherwise, to expand his holdings. The Indian agent in Prescott was in his pocket, and the territorial courts moved slowly when native claims were involved. "How many of your people remain in the band?" Ethan asked, already forming plans. "Less than 30 now," Noah replied quietly. "Many left for the reservation near Flagstaff after the last drought. But some of us keep to the old ways, moving with the seasons. Our horses are our life." The pride in his voice was tempered by uncertainty about their future. The band's numbers were too small to resist Turner's encroachment for long. Ethan made a decision. "I have friends in Yuma, honest men in the territorial office. If we can get proof of Turner's methods, they'll act." He paused, considering the risks. "But first, we need to protect your people and the horse herd. I know a hidden valley 3 days' ride from here. Turner's men won't find you there." Noah considered this carefully, his dark eyes searching Ethan's face for any sign of deception. Finally, he nodded. "My sister Clara helps manage our family's horses. She will know which ones are strong enough for the journey. But we must move quickly. Turner's men patrol at dawn and dusk." The plan took shape as they talked. Noah would return to his people's camp and prepare them for the move, while Ethan would ride to Globe to gather intelligence on Turner's legal claims. They would meet again in 2 days at an ancient petroglyph site both knew well. As they prepared to part ways, Noah suddenly turned back to Ethan. "Why do you help us? Most white men see only land to be taken." The question was direct, honest, demanding an equally honest answer. Ethan thought of White Eagle, of the lessons in honor and respect he'd learned from the old chief. "Because your grandfather once showed mercy to a foolish young man who thought he could tame these territories alone," Ethan replied, the memory still vivid after 15 years. "He taught me that the land belongs to no one. We belong to it." Turner and his kind never learned that truth. The sun was setting as they rode their separate ways, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. Ethan knew the coming days would test them all. Turner wouldn't give up his expansion plans easily, and violence seemed increasingly likely. But looking back at Noah's retreating figure, Ethan saw White Eagle's strength living on in his grandson. Some things were worth fighting for, even in these changing times. The following days brought an unsettling quiet to the territory between Prescott and Globe. Ethan spent them scouting the perimeter of Turner's expanding ranch, noting the fresh survey markers and newly strung barbed wire that crept steadily toward Cheyenne lands. The rancher's men worked with methodical determination, pushing boundaries that weren't theirs to push. From his vantage point in the hills, Ethan could see the smoke from their camps rising like accusing fingers into the autumn sky. In Prescott, tension simmered beneath the surface of daily life. Alexander, the town's aging sheriff, pulled Ethan aside outside the general store one morning. "Turner's been recruiting," he warned in a low voice, "bringing in hard men from Yuma, the kind that ask no questions and shoot first." The sheriff's weathered face carried the weight of impending trouble. "I can't stop him legally. His paperwork's too clean. but we both know what's really happening here. Ethan spent that afternoon in the town's cramped telegraph office, sending messages to contacts in Flagstaff who might help. The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Ethan Mitchell guided his horse through the rugged terrain north of Prescott. His weathered face bore the marks of countless days spent tracking through these borderlands, but today's mission felt different. Word had reached him about Cheyenne riders spotted near the contested Phillips Ranch, land that had been promised to both settlers and the tribe through conflicting territorial agreements that were about to come to a head. Deep in thought, Ethan almost missed the telltale signs: scattered eagle feathers and fresh hoofprints leading east toward the Red Cliffs. As an interpreter who had spent years learning the Cheyenne language and customs, he recognized the markers for what they were. A young warrior had passed through recently, riding hard and possibly wounded. The tracks showed an uneven gait that spoke of injury or exhaustion. The sound of distant gunfire snapped Ethan's attention to the horizon. Through his brass spyglass, he spotted 3 riders pursuing a lone figure who could only be the Cheyenne youth he'd been tracking. The pursuers wore the distinctive dark coats of Alexander Turner's hired guns, brutal men who had been terrorizing both settlers and natives alike as Turner expanded his cattle empire through increasingly aggressive land grabs. Ethan knew the young rider was heading straight for Box Canyon, a deadly trap with sheer walls and no exit. Making a split-second decision, he spurred his horse toward a parallel ravine that would intersect the chase. If he pushed hard enough, he might be able to reach the canyon entrance first and prevent what would surely become a slaughter. The weight of his Winchester rifle against his shoulder was reassuring as he rode. The pursuing riders were gaining ground quickly, their shots getting closer to their quarry with each report. As Ethan emerged from the ravine, he caught his first clear glimpse of the Cheyenne rider. It was Clara, the chief's daughter and last surviving heir to the tribe's leadership. Her father had been killed in a suspicious accident at Turner's main ranch just weeks before, and now it was clear this was no random pursuit. Ethan positioned himself behind a massive boulder near the canyon entrance, carefully timing his intervention. As Clara's exhausted horse thundered past, he rose and fired 3 rapid shots, forcing Turner's men to dive for cover. The surprise attack bought precious seconds as Clara disappeared into the twisting canyon. The hired guns, not expecting resistance, pulled up short and exchanged uncertain glances. "This doesn't concern you, Mitchell," shouted Jacob Roberts, Turner's lead enforcer. "The girl's got something that belongs to Mr. Turner. Walk away now, and there won't be any trouble." Ethan's only response was to chamber another round with an ominous click that echoed off the canyon walls. He knew Turner's claim was a lie. The man was after the tribe's ancestral documents that would prove their right to the contested grazing lands. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring until one of Turner's men made the mistake of trying to edge around Ethan's position. The sharp crack of his rifle put a bullet through the man's hat, sending him scrambling back. "Next one won't be a warning," Ethan called out, his voice carrying the steel of absolute conviction. "This ends now. Return to Turner and tell him the Phillips land dispute will be settled by the territorial courts, not by gunmen hunting down innocent women." Instead of retreating, Roberts and his remaining men spread out to flank Ethan's position. But before they could close the trap, war cries echoed through the canyon as a dozen mounted Cheyenne warriors emerged from hidden positions in the rocks above. They had been watching and waiting, using Clara as bait to draw out Turner's true intentions. The hired guns, suddenly finding themselves severely outnumbered, wheeled their horses and fled. Ethan lowered his rifle as Frances, the elderly medicine woman who had helped raise Clara after her mother's death, approached on horseback. "You have proven yourself a true friend to our people," she said in her native tongue. "Clara carries not just documents, but our future. The horses you were promised will be waiting at the sacred springs when the moon is full." Ethan nodded in understanding. He had earned far more than just horseflesh today. He had helped preserve a way of life. The next few hours were spent carefully escorting Clara and the warriors back to their hidden camp in the high country. Along the way, she told Ethan about Turner's increasing desperation to claim the Phillips Ranch before the territorial governor arrived for the official survey. The land baron had already bribed several officials, but the tribe's ancestral documents would expose his schemes if they reached the proper authorities. As the group made camp that evening, Ethan learned that Noah Phillips, the original rancher who had first welcomed the Cheyenne to graze their horses on his land, had been Clara's godfather. His widow Helen still lived on the ranch, secretly supporting the tribe's claim while publicly maintaining neutrality. The complex web of relationships and loyalties ran deep in this contested territory where bloodlines and fence lines often crossed. That night, as Ethan kept watch over the sleeping camp, he reflected on how this land dispute was so much more than just a fight over grazing rights. It was about honor, tradition, and the true meaning of justice in a rapidly changing frontier. The finest horses in the territory would be a generous reward, but knowing he had helped preserve something precious and irreplaceable was worth far more. The first rays of dawn revealed riders approaching from the south. Men working for Alexander Burke, the land baron who sought to seize the Cheyenne territory through legal manipulation. Ethan quickly roused the camp, helping Clara gather the precious documents while their companions prepared for a hasty departure. The morning mist provided some cover, but they would need more than nature's assistance to evade their pursuers. Through winding ravines and across shallow creek beds, they made their way toward Prescott, where a sympathetic judge awaited their evidence. But Burke's men were familiar with these lands, and the sound of hoofbeats echoed too close for comfort. Clara revealed a hidden trail that her people had used for generations, a narrow path through towering red rocks that could barely accommodate a single rider. Benjamin, an elderly member of the tribe who had joined their group, shared stories of how this same path had saved his people during past conflicts. His weathered face carried the weight of those memories as he guided them through the treacherous terrain. The horses moved carefully, their hooves finding purchase on ancient stone worn smooth by time and weather. At midday, they reached a secluded box canyon where Helen Phillips maintained a line camp, one of several safe havens she had established to help the tribe. The small cabin, nearly invisible against the rust-colored cliffs, offered a brief respite and a chance to review their strategy. Inside, they found supplies and a message from Frances, Helen's daughter, warning of increased patrols along the main roads to Prescott. Ethan studied the crude map Frances had left, showing the locations of Burke's men. The land baron had positioned his forces strategically, creating a net that would be difficult to slip through. But there was a weakness. Burke's ego had led him to concentrate his efforts on the more obvious routes, leaving the more challenging paths through the high country relatively unguarded. Clara spoke of her father's teachings about the mountain passes, describing trails that only the most skilled riders could navigate. These paths, while dangerous, could lead them to Globe, where they could catch the stage to Prescott. The risk was considerable. One misstep could send horse and rider plummeting into the depths. But it offered their best chance of outmaneuvering Burke's men. As they prepared to leave the safety of the canyon, Benjamin performed a brief ceremony, burning sage and offering prayers for protection. The ritual reminded Ethan of the deeper significance of their mission. This wasn't just about land ownership, but about preserving a way of life that was rapidly disappearing across the territory. The afternoon brought them to higher elevations, where the air grew thin and the wind carried the scent of pine. Their horses, bred for this rugged country, picked their way carefully along narrow ledges while storm clouds gathered ominously above. The weather would either be their ally or their undoing, depending on how quickly the storm arrived. Through his field glasses, Ethan spotted dust clouds in the distance. Burke's men had found their trail and were attempting to parallel their course in the valley below. But the approaching storm would soon erase all signs of their passage, and the treacherous terrain ahead would force their pursuers to take longer, safer routes if they wished to continue the chase. Clara rode beside Ethan now, her face set with determination as she led them higher into the mountains. She spoke of her grandfather's prophecy that the tribe's future would depend on the actions of a stranger who carried truth in his heart. The weight of those words pressed upon Ethan as they climbed, each step bringing them closer to either salvation or disaster. The first drops of rain began to fall as they crested a ridge overlooking a vast expanse of wilderness. Somewhere ahead lay Globe and the promise of justice, but the journey would test every skill and ounce of courage they possessed. The thunder rolling across the sky seemed to echo the hoofbeats of Burke's men, a reminder that time was as much their enemy as the men who pursued them. The scorching sun beat down mercilessly as Ethan Mitchell crouched behind a weathered boulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Below him, in the narrow canyon near Prescott's territorial boundary, he could see the dust cloud rising from at least 20 riders. They were closing in on the small group of Cheyenne refugees he'd been tracking for the past 3 days. Among them was young Hawk, the last surviving heir of the Northern Cheyenne chief Black Wolf. and his guardian, Helen Turner, a former missionary who had devoted her life to protecting the boy after his father's death. The pursuing men, led by the ruthless land baron Alexander Phillips, had already driven dozens of native families from their ancestral grounds, using forged documents and corrupted territorial officials to claim vast swaths of land. But Young Hawk's group represented something different. They carried proof of their legal claim to over 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, documents that Phillips would kill to destroy. Ethan had stumbled upon this chase by accident, but now he couldn't turn away. Sweat trickled down his neck as he calculated his options. The canyon walls were too steep for the refugees to climb, and Phillips' men had them boxed in from both directions. But Ethan knew something they didn't: an old mine shaft that cut through the ridge above, emerging behind the pursuers. He'd discovered it years ago while prospecting with his friend Benjamin Roberts, who now served as deputy marshal in Prescott. The shaft could be their only chance. Moving with careful precision, Ethan worked his way along the ridge until he spotted Helen's group. They had taken shelter in a small box canyon, but it would soon become their trap. Young Hawk, no more than 14, stood tall beside Helen, his face set with determination that belied his years. 3 other Cheyenne families huddled behind them, exhausted from days of running. Ethan knew he had to act fast. Using a small mirror he carried in his saddlebag, Ethan caught Helen's attention with a flash of reflected sunlight. Her head snapped up, years of frontier life having honed her instincts. When she spotted him, relief flooded her features. They had met briefly in Prescott months ago, and she knew his reputation as an honest man. Ethan used hand signals to direct her attention to the mine shaft entrance, partially hidden by scrub brush about 50 yards up the canyon wall. The sound of Phillips's men growing closer spurred Ethan into action. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard and began picking his way down toward Helen's position. The rough terrain worked to his advantage, providing cover as he moved. Phillips's men were focused on the canyon mouth, not expecting trouble from above. Ethan reached the refugees just as the first shots rang out, bullets sparking off rocks around them. "The shaft leads through to the other side," Ethan explained quickly, helping Helen gather the children. "It's narrow but passable. We'll need to move fast." Young Hawk's eyes met his, showing not fear, but a warrior's understanding of tactical advantage. The boy immediately began organizing his people, speaking rapidly in Cheyenne while Helen translated for Ethan. They would need to create a diversion to reach the shaft entrance. Ethan's horse, a sturdy paint he'd raised from a colt, was hidden in a nearby ravine. He retrieved his saddlebags, which contained several sticks of dynamite left over from his mining days. While Helen led the first group toward the shaft, Ethan and Young Hawk prepared their surprise for Phillips's men. The boy's knowledge of explosives surprised Ethan. He had learned from traders who visited his father's camp. The plan came together with desperate speed. They positioned the dynamite in a narrow section of the canyon, where the walls would amplify the blast. Ethan's heart pounded as he heard Phillips shouting orders to his men, their horses' hooves growing louder. Young Hawk remained steady beside him, holding the striker with unwavering hands. They waited until the exact moment, then lit the fuse and scrambled up toward the shaft entrance. The explosion shook the canyon, sending a cascade of rocks and debris raining down. The shocked screams of horses and men echoed off the walls as Phillips' group scattered in confusion. Through the chaos, Ethan and Young Hawk reached the shaft where Helen waited. They plunged into the darkness just as bullets began whizzing past, the sound of gunfire nearly drowned out by Phillips's enraged howls. The pursuit had become personal now. They had humiliated him in front of his men. The next hour was a nightmare of stumbling through the pitch-black tunnel, helping children and elders over fallen timbers and around cave-ins. The air grew thick and stale, but Young Hawk's people remained silent, understanding that sound could travel through the rock. Ethan led them, counting his steps, praying his memory of the shaft's layout was accurate. Behind them, they could hear Phillips' men trying to follow, their voices muffled but growing closer. Finally, Ethan felt the draft of fresh air he'd been searching for. The exit was just ahead, opening onto a steep slope that led down to a hidden valley. But as they emerged into the blinding sunlight, they found Jacob Turner, Helen's estranged husband, waiting with several armed men. Unlike Phillips's gang, these men wore badges. The territorial marshal himself stood among them, his expression grim but not hostile. The game had just changed again. The marshal stepped forward, his weathered face catching the harsh sunlight. "Ethan McBride," he called out, using a name Ethan hadn't heard in years. "I've been tracking this situation since Prescott. Helen here," he gestured to the woman standing beside Jacob, "brought some interesting documents to my attention." The young Cheyenne heir, who Ethan had been protecting, pressed closer to his side, dark eyes darting between the armed men. The tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Behind them, Philip's men were still navigating the tunnel, their echoing footsteps growing louder. Ethan's mind raced, calculating odds and angles, knowing they were trapped between two forces. But the marshal's next words changed everything. "Those land deeds Phillips has been waving around? Forgeries. Every last one of them." Helen stepped forward, her face lined with guilt and determination. "I found the real documents in Jacob's study," she explained, her voice carrying across the rocky ground. "The treaties were never nullified. This land still belongs to the Cheyenne by right of the original territorial agreement. Jacob and Phillips have been working together, trying to force them out before anyone discovered the truth." The sound of running feet echoed from the tunnel mouth. Phillips and his men burst into the sunlight, guns already drawn, but froze at the sight of the marshal's posse. Phillips' face contorted with rage when he saw Helen standing with the lawman. "You treacherous little," he began, but the marshal's raised hand cut him off. "Alexander Phillips, you're under arrest for fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy against the territorial government," the marshal announced. The morning air grew thick with the metallic sound of weapons being cocked. Phillips' men looked uncertainly at their leader, whose face had gone from red to ashen gray. But Phillips wasn't finished. With a motion too quick to follow, he grabbed the nearest child from the group of Cheyenne refugees and pressed a gun to her head. "Nobody's arresting anybody," he snarled. "I've invested too much in this land to lose it now. We're all going to back away nice and slow, or this little one joins her ancestors." The child didn't make a sound, but Ethan could see her trembling. The marshal's men held their positions, weapons steady, but unable to risk a shot. Jacob Turner stepped forward, his hands raised. "Alex, think about what you're doing. It's over. The truth's out now." "The truth?" Phillips laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "The truth is, this territory belongs to those strong enough to take it. These savages had their chance. Times are changing." His finger tightened on the trigger, and Ethan saw the child close her eyes. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The young Cheyenne heir, who had been watching everything with those ancient eyes and a young face, made a sharp gesture. From the rocks above, a shower of arrows suddenly descended. Philip's men scattered, and in that moment of chaos, Ethan moved. His body acted on instinct, years of frontier survival taking over as he tackled Phillips, twisting the gun away from the child. They rolled across the rocky ground, fighting for control of the weapon. Phillips was strong, desperate, but Ethan had something more powerful driving him: the memory of every innocent life this man had destroyed in his grab for power. The gun went off, the sound explosive in the confined space, and Phillips went limp. In the aftermath, as the marshal's men rounded up Phillips' surviving gang, the young heir approached Ethan. He spoke in perfect English, surprising everyone. "My grandfather always said the old ones would provide when the time was right," he said, gesturing to the hidden warriors who had appeared from the rocks. "You helped us preserve our land. Now we have a debt to repay." The heir led Ethan to a hidden valley where hundreds of horses grazed, the finest stock Ethan had ever seen, descended from the original Cheyenne herds. "Choose 30, the heir said. "They are yours, along with our friendship." Helen appeared at Ethan's side, her hand finding his. The morning sun painted the valley in shades of gold, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was truly home. The high desert wind carried the scent of sage and victory as Ethan Mitchell gazed across the sprawling valley where hundreds of magnificent horses now grazed freely. The young Cheyenne heir, Noah Phillips, stood beside him, his dark eyes reflecting both gratitude and ancestral wisdom beyond his 15 years. The past weeks had transformed them both. Ethan from a simple ranch hand into a man who defied the corrupt land barons of Prescott, and Noah from a hunted boy into the rightful guardian of his people's legacy. Alexander Turner's body lay in an unmarked grave somewhere in the canyons near Globe, his grand schemes of stealing the Cheyenne horse herds dying with him. The wealthy rancher's demise had sent shockwaves through the territory, But few mourned the man who'd murdered Noah's father and attempted to claim the sacred breeding grounds through forged documents and hired guns. His death had come not from Ethan's hand, but from his own treachery when he'd fallen into a ravine while pursuing them. Frances Roberts, the schoolteacher who'd first alerted Ethan to Noah's plight, rode up on her dappled mare. Her normally pristine dress was trail dusty, but her eyes sparkled with triumph. She'd risked everything to help them, using her position in Prescott society to gather intelligence and create diversions while Ethan spirited Noah away from Turner's compound. The connection between them had grown stronger with each passing day, though neither had spoken of it yet. The territorial judge signed the final papers this morning, Frances announced, pulling a leather document case from her saddlebag. The entire range is now legally recognized as Cheyenne territory, with Noah as the rightful heir and custodian. She handed the papers to Noah, who received them with quiet dignity. The boy had shown remarkable courage throughout their ordeal, never losing faith in the spirits of his ancestors or the justice of their cause. Benjamin Perez, the half-Mexican scout who'd guided them through the most treacherous parts of their journey, emerged from a cluster of cottonwoods leading his paint horse. He'd proven invaluable not only for his tracking skills but for his deep knowledge of both native and white ways. Turner's remaining men have cleared out of Prescott, he reported. Word of his death reached his backers in Flagstaff. They've withdrawn their support for the land grab. The horses were more than just property. They were living symbols of the Cheyenne people's endurance. Noah's father had spent decades selectively breeding them, combining the strongest bloodlines from both wild and domestic stock. Turner had coveted them not just for their exceptional quality but for what they represented. The power to control the territory's future through superior horseflesh. Now they would serve their intended purpose, helping to preserve Cheyenne traditions. Clara Turner, Alexander's daughter, appeared at the edge of the camp, her presence causing a momentary tension. But she'd proven herself different from her father, secretly helping them gather evidence of his crimes. "I've come to make things right," she said, holding out a stack of letters. "These prove my father's conspiracy with the land office in Yuma. No one can challenge Noah's claim now." Her voice held both sorrow and determination. As the sun began to set, painting the cliffs in shades of amber and rose, Noah performed a ceremony of gratitude. The haunting notes of his wooden flute drifted across the valley, calling the horses to gather near. Ethan watched in awe as the magnificent animals moved like a living river, their coats gleaming in the fading light. This was what they'd fought for. Not just justice, but the preservation of something profound and irreplaceable. Frances moved closer to Ethan, her hand finding his. "Noah wants you to choose 12 of the finest horses," she said softly, a traditional gesture of thanks among his people. Ethan started to protest, but Noah's quiet voice interrupted. "You restored more than our horses," the boy said. "You helped preserve our way of life. These animals carry the spirits of my ancestors. They will help you build something new." The decision to stay had already formed in Ethan's heart. He would establish his own ranch nearby, close enough to help protect the Cheyenne lands, but respecting their boundaries. Frances had already accepted a position at the new school being built for both native and white children. Benjamin would continue his work as a scout, bridging the gap between cultures. They had created something rare in this harsh territory, a peace built on mutual respect and understanding. As night fell, they gathered around the fire while Noah shared stories passed down through generations. The flames cast dancing shadows on the canyon walls, and the horse's soft nickering provided a gentle counterpoint to his words. Clara sat among them, finding healing in these ancient tales. The wind carried away the last echoes of conflict, leaving behind the promise of a different kind of future for this corner of the frontier. Ethan realized that his reward wasn't just the magnificent horses grazing nearby. It was the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting, but from standing firm for what's right. The last Cheyenne heir was safe. The horses would remain with their rightful guardians, and the land would continue to sustain both its original inhabitants and those who chose to respect its sacred nature. As the stars emerged above the mesas, their light seemed to bless the unlikely family that had formed in the shadow of conflict. The morning brought news that would further secure their future. Jacob Mitchell, Ethan's estranged brother and a prominent lawyer in Flagstaff, had successfully lobbied for new territorial laws protecting native land claims. The documentation he'd prepared would ensure that no one could ever again attempt what Turner had tried. The brothers' reconciliation added another layer of healing to the transformation that had touched everyone involved in their struggle. Helen Perez, Benjamin's wife, arrived with supplies from Prescott and plans for building a proper school where Francis would teach. The community taking shape around them would become a model for cooperation between cultures, proving that the frontier's future didn't have to be written in blood. The horses Noah had gifted to Ethan would form the foundation of a breeding program that would benefit both their peoples, creating partnerships instead of divisions. As they prepared to move the herd to their summer grazing grounds, Ethan looked at the faces around him. Frances with her quiet strength, Noah with his ancient wisdom, Benjamin with his bridge-building spirit, Clara with her hard-won independence, and all the others who'd chosen to be part of this new beginning. The last Cheyenne heir had not just survived. He had helped forge a new kind of community, one that honored the best of both worlds. The horses thundered across the valley, their hooves drumming out a rhythm that sounded like hope. As autumn approached, the success of their cooperative settlement drew both admiration and suspicion from neighboring territories. Word spread about the unusual alliance between Ethan's group and Noah's people, bringing curious visitors from as far as Globe and Yuma. The horses they bred became known throughout the Arizona Territory for their strength and intelligence, a living testament to the partnership that had saved both communities. Frances expanded her teaching beyond just the children, holding evening classes where both settlers and Cheyenne shared their knowledge. Noah taught traditional plant medicine while Benjamin contributed his engineering expertise, creating an exchange of wisdom that enriched everyone. Clara's organizational skills proved invaluable as she developed a system for documenting both written and oral histories, preserving stories that might otherwise have been lost. The transformation of the valley wasn't without its challenges. Some ranchers from Flagstaff accused them of giving away valuable grazing rights, while others questioned the legitimacy of Noah's claim to the land. But Ethan and Benjamin had carefully documented every agreement, creating legal protections that even the most antagonistic officials couldn't dispute. Their methodical approach to building consensus became a model for other territories dealing with similar conflicts. As winter settled over the high country, the community faced its first real test. Heavy snows threatened to isolate them, but the combined knowledge of winter survival techniques from both cultures helped them thrive. The Cheyenne showed the settlers how to preserve food using traditional methods, while Benjamin's engineering skills helped create more efficient shelter designs that incorporated both Western and indigenous approaches. The horses proved their worth during these harsh months. The breed's natural hardiness, developed through generations of careful selection by Noah's ancestors, helped them maintain crucial supply lines to Prescott when other routes became impassable. The success of these winter runs enhanced the reputation of their horse breeding program, bringing offers of partnership from ranchers who had once been skeptical. Spring brought new possibilities as Frances and Ethan announced their engagement, symbolizing the deeper bonds forming between the two communities. Their wedding combined traditional Cheyenne ceremonies with Western customs, creating something entirely new that reflected the spirit of their settlement. Noah presided over parts of the ceremony, his presence a reminder of how far they'd come from the days when such unions would have been unthinkable. The settlement's success attracted the attention of territorial officials seeking solutions to similar conflicts elsewhere. Benjamin's detailed records of their legal framework and Clara's documentation of their social arrangements provided a blueprint that others could follow. Their valley became a living example of how respect and cooperation could transform the frontier's future. As summer returned, the horse herd had grown significantly, with new foals carrying the distinctive bloodlines that made them so valuable. Ethan and Noah worked together to maintain the breeding program's integrity, ensuring that both traditional knowledge and modern techniques were properly balanced. Their partnership demonstrated how the best of both worlds could create something greater than either could achieve alone. The community's children grew up speaking multiple languages and moving easily between cultures, embodying the future they had all fought to create. Frances's school became known for its innovative approach to education, drawing families who wanted their children to learn in an environment of cultural respect and understanding. The next generation would inherit not just the finest horses in the territory, but also the wisdom to maintain the delicate balance their parents had achieved. Looking out over the valley one evening, Ethan reflected on how a single act of rescue had grown into something far more significant. The last Cheyenne heir had not only survived but had helped create a new kind of community that proved the frontier's future could be built on cooperation rather than conflict. The thundering hooves of their horses still echoed across the land, but now they carried the sound of promise instead of pursuit, of building instead of breaking, of a future limited only by their ability to imagine it together.